Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it is time to do the second episode of the What If series on the channel. You guys enjoyed the first one, and I got a few recommendations, and we're doing one of them. And today it is What If the Memphis Showboats beat the San Antonio Brahmas in Week 2 of the 2024 UFL season. Now this is one of those that on the surface might not seem like a huge what if, and well, we'll get to exactly what I think would have happened, but this is something that if you know football and really sports in general, you know is a big deal. That's momentum, right? Momentum, mentality, all those things. And this game very much changed the outlook for both these teams, but mainly Memphis. Memphis was not the same team after this game. As if you remember what happened in this game, it was bad. Now, before I get into that, I want to thank Car83 for the suggestion. Again, I got a couple other suggestions, with a couple of them being really good, but there's a lot I have to think about with some of those other ones because there's a lot of big changes. But this was one that I thought was a very interesting one. Again, it's a simple one, but I think it does have some merit to what would have changed. Now, for those of you who don't know what happened, in Week 2 of the UFL's past season, the Brahmas and Showboats played. Now, for 3 quarters, the Brahmas offense was doing not a ton. Now, yes, a lot of that admittedly was due to penalties. They got a bunch of penalties, 14 for 142. But they weren't doing a ton. To the point where in the first 3 quarters, they put up 0. The Memphis Showboats defense was going to absolutely shut them out, and it was going to be an easy win for the Showboats. Then the 4th quarter came, and what ended up happening is with 55 seconds left, the Brahmas scored a touchdown. Then they did the alternate kickoff, the 4th and 12, converted it, and then they scored another touchdown with less than 10 seconds left to take the lead and win the game. That's bad. The Showboats blew a free win. They allowed 2 touchdowns in 1 minute of game time. I've done a whole video on this one before, so you can click the little eye icon to go check that one out. This was an absurd moment. The fact is the Brahmas had no business winning this game, yet the Showboats somehow found a way to lose, right? It's like that, it's the joke saying, right? They were able to snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. And that's exactly what happened. So, what exactly is the big deal about this game? Well, we're going to start with the Showboats, because I think this is the one that most people would want to know what would happen. So the Showboats were 1-0 heading into this game. They had beaten the Roughnecks team. Granted, the final score was a really awkward game against Houston. Houston had chances late, but Memphis did end up holding on to win the game. Now, they only allowed 174 yards in that game. And against the Brahmas, again, yes, as we talked about, there was a lot of penalty yardage. But through the first 3 quarters, they allowed less than 100 total yards of offense to the Brahmas. So it was on pace to have 2 games combined for less than 400 yards of offense allowed. That's crazy. And it may have been a little bit over 400 if that pace ended up being, what it should be. But the fact that they were able to do that, or almost able to do that, shows that this Showboats defense was playing really well. Now, granted, we know what ended up happening with the Houston Roughnecks offense. We knew later on that it was a terrible unit, but at the time we didn't think it was a bad unit. We thought it was, just issues or the Showboats defense playing good because, they had all the receivers. We thought they would at least be okay. Granted, they had a very poor quarterback. We didn't think they were going to be as bad as they ended up being. Now, the Brahmas offense, granted, was about a bit the opposite. We expected it to not be great, ended up being better than we thought it was. But even then, through 2 weeks, they were looking to hold teams for under 400 combined yards or just over it. Instead, the 4th quarter happened. They allowed 211 yards in that quarter, allowed 20 points in that quarter, and at the end of the year, the Showboats defense was the worst in the league. They allowed the most yardage by a mile, and they had the most points allowed by a mile. So the Showboats defense never recovered after this game, right? When you look at this scoreboard or this week-to-week chart here, right, you're seeing 30-plus point games every single week up until week 8. Think about that. Week 3, they got 33 put on them, then 32, 35, 39, 47. Now, yes, they had a couple of weeks at the end of the year where they allowed less than 20, but when you look at it, the defense got absolutely hammered week to week to week afterwards. Now, is this Showboats defense a super talented unit? No, we knew that. But despite what some, pro, like PFF stats would have you think, the 2023 Showboats defense in the USFL was a good unit despite the fact that talent-wise it wasn't the most talented group. It was very much just a defense playing together. It was a really solid unit. The 2024 defense did lose a couple of those really good PFF cornerbacks, But all in all, we didn't think it was going to fall off that bad, if at all. And again, through the first 2 weeks, it looked like it was still going to be good, and then they fell off a cliff after the Brahmas game. That's because I think the Brahmas game basically mentally destroyed the Showboats defense. I think that was when you see that as a defensive player, you're like, wow, we really just got hammered like that. And they never recovered. So that brings us to the other issue, and that's the quarterback and running back issue. Now, the QB issue is that basically immediately after this game, T. Will would start coming in. And it started the whole QB controversy between the two of them. If the Showboats win this game, I fully believe that T. Will still end up playing for the Showboats, but it would have probably been pushed back to about week 5 or maybe late in week 4. My guess is probably week 5 is when he would fully come in as like a legit player for them. That would be my guess because I feel like they would have given, Cook some of a leash or somewhat of a leash. But we'll get to why that is in a second. But the fact is that they had the whole QB issues that ended up happening where up until the end where they just, said, F it, let's let Josh Love play. They were basically flip-flopping between Cookus and T. Will after this game. And the running back problem, I don't think would have really been much different. Look, the one thing I think that this what-if doesn't change is the Showboats offense. I think at the end of the day, the Showboats offense really wasn't going to be what we all thought it was going to be. Despite the talent on paper being the best when it comes to the number one player of each position group, right, as we've talked about it before. When you look at their best O-lineman, their best QB, their best running back, their best receiver, best tight end, they were the best team in the league in that regard on paper. It just never translated to on the field. So I think that their offense would have still been an issue, and that's what leads me to my what assumed record for them in 2024 had they have won this game. So if they've beaten the Brahmas, obviously they, get the W there. Now, I do still think they lose to Birmingham and St. Louis. St. Louis offense was finally starting to kick it into full gear for like the 3 weeks they did all of last year. So I think they still would have lost that one. Birmingham was still clearly the class of the league. They would have lost that one. But I do think they would have beaten Michigan. Michigan, at that point in the season, was still an offense that a lot of people had a lot of concerns about. They'd only had one actually good offensive performance heading into that Week 5 game. So I think that instead of them having that second one against Memphis, I think that Memphis's defense is going to be a better unit because they didn't choke that game to the Brahmas and they lost to two teams that had offenses that we actually thought were going to be good. So that's why I think that against Michigan the first time around, I do think they would have held them to about half of what they ended up putting up. Now, offensively, it's tough to say, but, with a better defense, it helps you get somewhat better field position, sometimes turnovers and all that. So I do think that they get the W in Week 5. I do think they get swept by Birmingham, and I do think they end up beating the Renegades in Week 7. The Renegades at that point were still a winless team, and I think that the Showboats team that would have been still very much in the playoff hunt, which they would be at this point, I think that they would have gone in to Arlington and gotten the W instead of getting absolutely hammered like they did. Now, with that being said, I do think they lose the rematch to Michigan at home. I think that ends up being one of those home series, right, where whoever's the home team wins it. I think that at that point, we knew Michigan's offense was a really solid unit, and even though that week they didn't put up a ton of points, the fact is Michigan at that point was a really solid team, and that game would have been far more important for Michigan as well than it ended up being. And then for some reason, I just feel they still lose to DC in Week 9. I think that DC at that point, even though they were basically eliminated, the way they were trying to win games at the end of the season to hit 500, I have a feeling they still would have lost that game. And then I still think they win in Week 10 to finish 5-5. So I think they still would have missed the playoffs, but only by one game. I think that at the end of the day, they would look back at their season and say, if we beat Michigan in Week 8, we would have made the playoffs over them. Again, the Arlington game, I understand why some people would say the opposite, but I just have a feeling that if the Showboats were actually in the playoff hunt heading into that game, they would have taken it as, they would have gone in full focus, not coming in there having basically been as bad as the Renegades. Because the Renegades at least were keeping teams, like field goal games and all that. I just have a feeling that in that Week 7 game, Arlington would have remained winless and that Memphis would have gotten the W to get back to being a winning team because heading into that game, they would be 3-3. So they get in the winning record, but then they lose the back-to-back games to Michigan and DC, which essentially eliminates them from the playoffs. That's what I think would happen to Memphis. Now, as for San Antonio is a weird team to look back on. Their first two wins, their first two games essentially, are two of the weakest wins in a back-to-back sense, probably in the ultramodern spring football history, maybe even just spring football history in general. Their week 1 game was not impressive at all, right? It took Jean Delance basically sabotaging the defenders for the Brahmas to win that, right? Jean Delance cost the defenders not 1, but 2 touchdowns. And then one of the touchdowns the Brahmas scored was a fluke. It was a great trick play. Well, not even a trick play. It was a fluky play. I mean, it was like a third read to an offensive lineman when Alex Millette caught that pass from Brad Wing. The point is, there was really a 3 touchdown difference. If you want to be that guy who says that, counting stuff in the fourth quarter isn't true, then even then it's still a 2 touchdown difference with the first quarter and the second quarter. The fact is, DC, despite getting beat by 15, really were almost as good, if not better, than San Antonio for most of that game. It was just that Jean Delance absolutely fumbled it for him, right? I'm not saying, it would have been a close game without Jean Delance. So the fact is that win is probably one of the most unimpressive double-digit victories you'll ever see. Then week 2, right? Their week 2 game was another very fluky victory. Yes, they had a lot of penalty yardages in the first 3 quarters. But the fact remains, they had to score 20 points in the fourth quarter, which included 2 touchdowns in the final minute. Again, a very fluky victory. So they were a very fluky team starting the season. I don't think it really changed anything, though. Look, at the end of the day, this team proved that those fluky wins, while fluky, and they were fluky, I know some people try to say they were fluky, not the most deserving of wins. This team ended up getting really good, right? The week 4 game against Michigan basically proved that this team was legit, and then they would go on to only lose 2 games, after the St. Louis game in week 3. I still think this team makes the playoffs. I don't know why. Every time I was looking back at the schedule, I just have that feeling that if they had lost that game in week 2, for some reason they lose the one in week 7. And my entire reasoning is that week 7 game against Houston was also a very fluky victory, right? It took Houston basically giving the game to San Antonio, and even then San Antonio tried to not even win it, right? That was when, they put in their third-string QB, and they ended up having that final drive, which got them the field goal. I have a feeling that if they had lost in week 2 to the Memphis Showboats, which was a very fluky end-of-the-game victory, they would have lost the Houston one. It's weird. I just have that feeling. But everything else, I think, honestly remains the same. I still think this team goes on to beat St. Louis in the playoff game. I still think they lose to them in week 10. And they still lose in the championship game. I still feel that way. I don't know why I wouldn't. Because, again, their first 2 wins, in reality, were fluky. But after week 3, when they lost to St. Louis, which admittedly was a much closer game than a lot of people expected it to be, their week 4 game against Michigan really proved they were a legit team. And after that, they were a good team. They lost to DC. And then the St. Louis loss really didn't even... I don't even view the St. Louis game as a loss because they were playing unbelievably injured and they still almost won it. The fact is, this Brahmas team was a lot better than what they looked like the first 2 weeks of the season. So even if they lose to the Showboats, I really don't think it changed anything for them. I just have that sneaking suspicion that they would have lost against Houston. They wouldn't have, they essentially went 3 for 3 in unbelievably fluky victories. I think that if they had lost to Memphis, they would have only gone 1-2. It's just kind of my thinking. But I still think they make the playoffs, and I still think they beat St. Louis in the first playoff game, then lose to Birmingham. That's kind of how I view it. So that'll do it. This has been Zom Fox. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Again, as a little side note as well, I obviously think that if the Showboats go 5-5 and miss the playoffs, I'm not fully sure if D. Filippo leaves or not, but I would still imagine he would leave because, again, the offensive line was horrific and they didn't change a lot. So I could buy an argument that either he stays or he still leaves and gets Wisenhunt to replace him. I don't know, but I will say if the defense ended up being better, it's a tough call. The coaching part for Memphis is definitely the one part that's definitely intriguing to think about. Had they have ended up, finishing 5-5, even though that still would have been a pretty disappointing finish. I can't say for certain. I still would imagine they would probably end up getting the new coach and GM. But let me know what you guys think down below. Do you agree with what I think would end up happening had the Showboats had won in week 2? Again, if you have any other suggestions for a future What If video, put them in the comments down below. Again, we've had a couple of them, which a couple of them are really good ideas. I really love the one about what if the dispersal draft was instead team to team. Like the Generals getting put into, let's say, the Houston Roughnecks or something like that. That would be a fun what if to do, and that one I might do in the future. That one's going to take a lot more research, obviously. But again, let me know what you think down below. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while, think about subscribing, because again, we're getting close to 1,000 subscribers. We're on the countdown, less than 100 away, doing a giveaway. And as always, guys, have a great night.